want to appear on the chat box or appear on the webinar, now is the time to leave and watch the recording. So the recording will obviously record anything that's written in the chat box and what Marie is saying. And the reason we record it is because in a couple of days' time, obviously it's the weekend coming up in the UK, so it'll be after the weekend. In a couple of days' time, we'll send you an email, and in that follow-up email, you'll get a link to the recording, you'll get a link to the slides, and a link to a certificate of participation, so you can be able to download that. And there'll also be a link for you to give feedback. Okay, that's enough from me now. So, Marie, would you like to appear? And I'll hand over to somebody I've known for quite a few years now, who's going to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is 21st century skills. Marie, where are you? Here he comes.
Okay, hello everyone. Let me adjust that. Yeah. Everyone can, okay, I'm getting hellos and highs, so that answers my next question, which is, can everyone hear me? I will type that in the chat box just in case someone is not getting the sound. Can everyone hear me? Okay, here we go. Okay, so hello from cold but sunny Oxford. It is the beginning of the afternoon here, and we're about to talk about 21st century skills and project work. First, I'd like to introduce myself for those of you new to webinars or new to some of my webinars. As you can see from the slide, my name is Verissimo, and I noticed that there were some people from Brazil, maybe one or two people from Portugal, some people from Argentina and from Italy. Just to confirm, the name is Latin. It is not Italian, it is Portuguese, and yes, it does mean very truthful in Latin. It's not only vero, but it's verissimo. So I am burdened with always telling the truth. So you can depend on what I'm about to say today, as I try to tell everyone and try to convince them. I would also like to say that we'll be talking primarily about project work, 21st century skills, as it relates to teenagers primarily, though what I am about to say probably works to some extent for primary or for adult students. I've been a teacher and teacher trainer for more years than I'd like to think about 30 years now. For those of you noticing the image on the video, yes, I started when I was about 15 years old. So I have taught classes from, 3 years old to adults. And in most of those, I have used project work. And in the last few years, as 21st century skills came up more and more, I have included that in my project work. In the beginning, when I was using project work, the term 21st century skills was not necessarily well known or used a lot in EFL. So today, as we talk about 21st century skills, I'm going to limit those skills to these 5 skills that you see here. Okay? And that is, I'm going to base it on critical thinking, collaboration, creativity, communication, and information communications technology, ICT. And 21st century skills obviously involves a lot more than this. It comes from mainstream education and goes into other subjects like citizenship. But for the purposes of both project work and an EFL classroom, we will limit ourselves to these 5 areas, and I will probably talk more about critical thinking, collaboration, and communication, and leaving creativity and ICT. Well, you'll see why probably there'll be less of that. One of the situations is obviously because of time. Okay, let's see these slides here. I'd like to start by just giving an example. And Elena, I see here that you have no sound, and I will let Sean probably take care of that. And as I was saying here, an example here, this is a project about a town. So you see a lot of maps, a lot of information about a town or a certain area. And what I'd like to say here is that we probably already use a lot of 21st century skills when we do project work. Project work lends itself to a lot of the skills that our students will need in the 21st century. And can I just say that in defining 21st century skills, it seems obvious, but those are the skills that your students will need in the 21st century. And the main issue in that is that education is changing, our society is changing, obviously because of technology, but because of other factors also. So the skills and what we need in the future, what your students will need in the future, will slightly change from what students needed 10, 20, maybe 30 years ago. So that's why we're talking so much about 21st century skills. And it's a matter of focus. It's a matter of emphasis. Some teachers always, they ask me, is it, I don't have time for anything new. And when we're talking about this project, and we're talking about, in this case, a project about your town, well, we're still talking about communication. We're still talking about the students being creative with that project and how they will publish it and how they will share it. We want students to think critically, to be actively involved in the project work, and I'll explain that better. And we want students to collaborate, to work together. Now, it seems to me as I talk about 21st century skills that one of the reasons it's so important also may be that in the last 15 years or in the last 20 years, education has changed to where some of these aspects, some of these skills have not been a part of the classroom, whether EFL or mainstream, and we need to bring them back. So if you look at a simple project, you'll probably see that these are part of that project. What I'd like to talk about today is you being able to develop this better in your classroom with your students and be able to give feedback and assess your students so that they will learn better as they are doing their project. Okay? Now, okay? So some of the aims that we have today to define what 21st century skills are for the ELT classroom, so we're going to limit them a little bit, to consider the role of the teacher and the student. So there will be a change in focus, a change in roles in each one as we want to develop those skills, encourage them in the classroom through project work. We want to include 21st century skills in the project work. They are an integral part of when we are doing a project. So they will be as important as the project itself. They will be as important as the language that is used in the project by the students. So the teacher will take an active role in encouraging and developing those skills as they give their project work in class. And then we want to assess the development of those skills as students do the project. Now, I was very careful when I put the word assess here. I'm always a bit weary when I talk about assessment and evaluation. And here I'd like to focus on assessment for learning. In other words, we are looking, observing what our students do. We are looking at the process of project work. We are assessing how well they are developing in the different skills, in the different 21st century skills that we're talking about today. And if we assess them, if we evaluate them, we can give them better feedback in order for them to react and adapt and learn better. So when I'm talking about assessment, I'm talking about assessment for learning, assessment to learn better rather than assessment as a judgment, good, bad, 1 through 5, or whatever it might be. Okay? So that's a very important point because I think that will make it more real for the students. Okay. Now, I will leave some time at the end for any questions. I will also be looking at the chat box. If you have any questions, please feel free. As Sean mentioned, he will also help me look for any questions that come up. I want to make this webinar as practical as possible in relation to the project work that you do as possible. So in that sense, any questions about what I'm saying or some of the points I might mention, I'll look down at the chat box every once in a while to see if there are any questions. If I miss any, I'll give some time at the end. I'll be here both on video, and then I'll be in the chat room through the chat box at the end of the webinar. Okay. Now, I'd like to start with communication as we talk about 21st century skills. Now, when we're talking about communication, it seems obvious that communication as part of a language classroom. So communication seems like an obvious starting point. And what I'd like to say about communication here is that for me, when it comes to 21st century skills, communication means getting the message across. And that in my class sometimes means you have a message. And not all my students have a message, which makes the project and it makes the language much more difficult for them. Many of them will look at me and say, "Teacher, what do you want me to say? What do you want me to do?" Well, in this case, in the sense of communication, what I want is, first, obviously, I want them to have a message. So if we take into consideration the project about the town or their area, I want them to tell me something about their area, one. And I want them to tell me something that others will be interested in hearing. So to get a message across depends on them having a message and depends on others wanting to hear that message. Okay? So I make that a central point if that isn't a central point already. Okay? Now, I ask them, who are they doing the project for? If they are talking about the town, who are they doing it for? I want them to get across that they're not doing it just for the teacher. And when they know who they are communicating to, their project, okay, and the language in their project and the presentation of their project will change. So who are they doing the project for becomes the first question that I want them to answer. So in this case, about the town, but we'll change the project as we go through the webinar. And then once they have decided who they are talking to, I want them to decide how will they get that message across. How will they communicate it? Now, let me pause here a little bit. And like I said, it's a sunny afternoon in Oxford, but it is cold. Usually I ask people to put their hands up. I'm going to change that a little bit. And I would like you to put on a happy face there. Put a happy face in the chat box. I'm one of those teacher trainers who like to see faces, but here I'm limited to happy faces. Put a happy face in the chat box if you use project work in your classes on a regular basis, if you use it or have used it. Okay? So if you have used and you're comfortable with project work in general, not necessarily with 21st century skills, can I just see some happy faces in the chat box so I can get an idea of, okay, yes, a lot, so some happy faces. We have about 150 people in the room, a lot of happy faces coming in. Good, okay, okay, good. Oh, I'm looking at the names to see. I see a yes, yes, great. Olesya is coming in with a happy face. Good, yes, okay, great. The reason I ask that now, and yeah, I'm looking, we're doing projects for pupils and students. Fantastic. Great, and thank you for the happy faces, because like I said, I am a teacher trainer. I do like to look at the reaction of the teachers in front of me. With a webinar, that's not always possible, and instead of seeing a series of hands, seeing a series of happy faces just makes me feel better, and it's less cold now. Okay, so in that sense, the reason I ask that is because I'm taking for granted that students here will know how to do the projects. Project work is part of the class, so we are reinforcing other things. So here, when we're talking about communication, who are they doing the project for? How will they communicate the project? It becomes important. And the reason I asked about project work in your classes is how will they communicate the project? Well, for anyone out there where project work is new or their students are not used to project work, so it's new for the students, not necessarily for the teacher, I usually tell my students that I want them all to make a poster. I want them all to make a video clip. This is so that since they're all working on how they will communicate the information, they will be able to help each other in getting that project presented and shared a little bit better. As they feel more confident, how will they communicate that message? I will leave it up to them. So some of them may want to do a PowerPoint presentation about the town. Others may want to do a poster presentation. Others may want to do their poster presentation on the web. Others may do a Pinterest or a Glogster, or others may put a blog. So how they will communicate, I will leave that up to them. If they're not very confident working on projects, I will try to have everyone work on the same projects, because that means people who are used to working on a blog will help those who are not. Okay, so having decided those two, I want them to decide if their final product is speaking, writing, or both. Okay? It can be both. You can include in that PowerPoint presentation, you can have all the writing on the slide, but you can have a voiceover for it also. So I want them to decide, because that will decide the skill they would need the most. That will also help me how to react to the group if I'm reacting to a speaking situation or to a writing situation. Okay? Now, we usually discuss them. Good. Speaking, great. Okay. So the students have decided who they are. Okay, who is it for? They're deciding who they're going to communicate and how they're going to communicate. They've decided if it's mostly speaking, writing, or both. Yes, I agree, both are important. In this case, I'll leave it up to the students. Some students, I suggest that they do one or the other, because they may need more work on one skill or the other. Again, up to you and how well you know your students. Now, I also want them to think about, in getting that message across, when will the students see their project? So if it's a blog post, when will they post, okay, their text and their pictures? If it's a poster in class, when will the poster be ready and when will we put it up? Now, this comes more specifically in recent years, because before, in doing project work, the result of the project usually was for the classroom or the school. So it was posters or oral presentations. But now, if you do Glogster or if you put it on Pinterest, you also want to do the, let's say, the advertising, the publicity. You want to encourage your friends to go online and to look at your project. So when will they see it and how will they see it becomes part of your project, because I want that message to be real. I want them to know they are getting that message across, they are communicating, and if they are communicating, they must consider that they have to tell all their friends, okay, where their project is, when it will be up, and how everyone will be able to see it. Do I need a website? Where is it going to be? So Elena here says students like using PowerPoint. Yeah, they are very technological. When technology comes in my classes, I've noticed that students always like more. There's something about technology that is almost, it is motivating. Okay, and as we continue here, so as we continue with the project, I notice and I want to reinforce to them that I want to look at the process. Okay, from when they've decided those questions I've just mentioned, as they work through the text, as I help them in correcting text and correcting language, in suggesting certain words or certain language, it is a process. So some students will work harder than others. Some students will have 2, 3 drafts of the language that they are working on. Others will have only 1 or 2. But it is a process. It is in that process that I make sure they're getting their message across. It is in that process that I ask, who are you talking to? Will your friends be interested in listening to this, in hearing this? If they are talking, my students, and I worked in Portugal, and my students would do a project about Porto, the city where we were in. And they would talk about some of the historic monuments, the tourist areas. And I would ask them, but wait a minute, is this really, if someone was coming from another country to Porto, is this really what you would suggest for them? And when they thought about it, they would change, maybe to the city park, maybe to the beach, a lot of them to the local sports stadium and the local teams. So again, in that process, I make sure they're getting that message across, and then I help them with the language. So my role as a teacher is to help them with the language that they need in order to get that project across. So I'm hoping that that language comes from our course book, because I'm going to make the project in a way that gives students an opportunity to use the language we are learning. I'm going to suggest language that they might avoid, and I'm going to correct language, either correct or get them to correct, or get them to show another student and have another student help them out. Okay? I'm noticing, okay, yeah, oh, I'm just looking at the chat box. So notice that the roles, the language, that process, as that message is getting across. So for me, getting the message across means you using the English they have learned. We are in an English class, and if students know why we are doing project work in relation to the English that they are learning, they feel much better on why we're doing it. So using the English they have learned to communicate their message to their friends. And the key words for me in that sentence are, okay, using the language they and their. It's their message, it's their friends. Okay, so as I get that communication, so students begin in 21st century skills, communication means the ability to get that message across. Not always easy, even in your first language, maybe even a little bit more difficult in a second language. So to reinforce that. And I assess my students as they are working on their projects. I assess them, I look at their language, I look at their project, and I think, is the information real? Is it real? 1. Is it interesting? Okay, who are they talking to? If they say, this is for my parents, or if they say, this is for teachers, it changes from if they say, this is for my friends, this is for the class. So I ask, is it interesting? And then, does the student use the language that they need for the project? And for example, you get mixed ability and differentiated learning in this context, because some students will use a lot of language, but they will avoid some language that you can push them a little bit. Okay? Then for those students, I take advantage and I work on that language. For students who may not be very confident, I may not push so much. So I am assessing and I am feeding back to them based on that project to improve their ability to communicate, to let them focus on communicating and using their language to get that message across. Okay, I'm going to pause a little bit here before going on to collaboration to take a look at the chat box. We seem to be okay. My pupils are fond of making PowerPoint presentations in small groups. Yes, notice I have not mentioned if they are working in groups, pairs, or individually. I will mention that in a bit because we are about to talk about collaboration. Publish them on the website. Okay, great. Okay, so the next one I'd like to talk about, and again, there's no order of importance here. Maybe there is in my head for my own students as I use this in class, and that is collaboration. I want my students to work together. Okay, I'm going to focus on 3 aspects of collaboration with my students that I think is important. Now, working well with others is probably something that I have heard as part of school and education, I think from the days when I was a student, not so long ago. But the idea of working well with others has always been an important factor. But can I say that I used to work and I used to do my English classes in a private language school. And working well with others meant one thing. And when I moved into mainstream education, and I had classes of 25 to 30 students, working well with others meant something completely different. And then it depended on the classroom. Was it set up in tables where they were already working in groups? Was it set up where they were working in pairs because there were 2 to a table, or was it set up where they were working individually? So working well with others meant a lot of different things. For me, it meant working with others. It also meant being helpful. That means being helpful with the materials, being helpful with the knowledge, your knowledge of English, being able to help another student with your knowledge of English that you may know, they may not, being helpful with your talents. A student who knows English very well, a student who is a good student, a strong student in English, if you will, but maybe cannot draw very well, maybe is not a very creative person, and another student who may not be very good in English. Languages, it may not be something that they feel comfortable with, but they may be very artistic, they may be very creative. One of the things I value a lot is when a student is able to draw. So again, being helpful also with their abilities, with their talents. Students who know to use technology very well and who know how to use a website or some of the things that we will be using with technology, they may know better than others. So being helpful with your talents, with your knowledge, with the materials you have, and then assuming responsibility, especially as Svetlana is saying here that the students are working in small groups. Well, assuming the responsibility for the group. If you are going to take pictures of your area in order to put it onto your project, to make sure that you do, that you have a camera, that your parents know that you may need their help for you to go out and take the photographs on the weekend. To be aware, not leaving it to the last minute. You leave it till the last weekend, you want to go out and take the photographs, and it happens to be a rainy day and you cannot go out. So assuming responsibility for deadlines, for the work that you've promised the group that you would do. And I look at these 3 aspects as I'm looking at collaboration. Now, collaboration is very important in 21st century skills for a very important reason. And I always like to mention this to my students, especially my stronger students, who usually feel that working with others is slowing them down. And I usually try to tell them that no matter how good they are, and they may have a fantastic idea, when they are at university or when they are working in a company, okay, if they cannot communicate their idea well and get others to be involved in their idea will probably die no matter how good it is. We don't work alone. So collaboration and communication come together, because if we have a good idea, okay, we probably will need the support of others within university or within the workplace to get our ideas into practice. Okay? Now, what exactly does that mean? Now, one of the things that happens in my classes a lot is that my students usually don't listen to each other in class. So if we are doing a normal activity, I notice there is a question here: how do I deal with students who dominate the other group members? So that's a very good question. You notice that, I don't know who I saw that question, thank you, Sean, and you notice that when we're talking about collaboration, I mentioned responsibility, and if I go back and show you what I'm looking at there, a student who dominates the other members of the group will not be working well, okay, will not be helpful, and I need, as a teacher, to intervene and help them see how to work in a group. A student once told me that it's not a very good idea to put a strong student with a weak student in a pair, or strong students, okay, and weaker students in a group. Because usually the stronger students will not pay attention to the weaker students because those roles are so defined for them. It is best to have students of similar abilities, if you will, together. I let them choose who they want to work with exactly for that reason. One, to avoid that someone will take over, will dominate, okay? And then I also go in there and try to see what are their different abilities, their different skills. A student may want to take control based on one or two skills, yet if I try to motivate and encourage the other skills in the group, the other talents, then I may spread that responsibility. Remember, it's part of a process, and it's part of the teacher's role not to let someone dominate in a group too much. Now, one of the things, however, I do get students who dominate. More importantly, my students will have trouble, in this case, listening to each other in class. If we're doing a basic grammar exercise, number 1, number 2, number 3, and I point to a student, Isabel, number 1, and Isabel answers the question, and then I say, Maria, is that correct? Maria was not listening. Maria looks at me and says, teacher, you were talking to Isabel. It's nothing to do with me. And most of my classes and most of my students felt that that was a normal behavior in class. So collaboration becomes important even when at a simple basis of listening to each other. So when I say Isabel number 1, I want everyone to be listening to Isabel so that if I say, is that correct? Isabel's language is helping everyone else. So at that simple level, if that is part of your class, make that collaboration part of the lessons where they listen to each other. Is that correct? Is that correct? Next, etc. So that they're not only, it's not student to teacher only, and then that kind of behavior, that kind of paying attention to each other will spread into the project work and into the into developing this sense of collaboration. Now, I mentioned whether I'm doing group or individual, I'm going to look at those 3 aspects anyway. Okay? Individually, I'm still looking for collaboration. Now, in groups, it may be more obvious, but individually, I still want a student to work with others. And what I mean is, a student has taken on the responsibility of doing that project themselves. They will be making their own poster. But there may be skills. There may be a way of doing their project. Simply, there may be another group or another student who is doing the same project, the same end product, the same final product. I would like that student to be open to share, to ask, to look, to be curious and see what is their project like. Do they have some ideas I can use? Do I have some ideas that they could use? So even if your project is individual, it's still very good to work with others, to share information, to share that knowledge, to see what the projects look like as part of that process, to offer your help, okay, and to accept help if someone suggests it, to allow your project to be open for others to see it, and when they make a suggestion, for you to be open to that help. Okay? And then if you see someone else's project and there's something you can help with, a photograph, an image from a magazine that you know about, or a talent you may have to be able to be helpful in that sense. assuming responsibility here is less because it is the student assuming the responsibility for the project for the class. If they promise that it will be up on a blog at X date, I want that responsibility there and all the work before that. If I need to correct a text by whatever date, I need that text by the date so the student can have that text back. So assuming that responsibility. That responsibility for that collaboration comes in group probably more easily. You can probably see how well they work together, okay, when it is in a group, because you are looking at how they divide the responsibilities, how they divide the tasks, what is each one contributing, okay? Are they being helpful to each other? Do they step in when they see someone in trouble, someone who may not be able to meet the responsibility, may not be able to meet the deadline? Do they step in? So individually or in a group, I look for these three things as they work through that process of doing their project. Are they collaborating? Now, when I say this, and I would like to reinforce this, for me, collaboration means working with others, fair enough, but working with others to achieve your best. Okay? And my main message for my students, as I am reinforcing and developing that 21st century skill, is that if you work with others, if you ask for their help, if you divide the responsibilities, you will see that you can achieve more than if you were working alone. Even if working alone means that you are very good, my aim here is that if you work with others, you would be even better. And what I don't want to hear at the end, when a student has their project done, is to say, they see someone else's project and they said, oh, I didn't know I could do it that way. Oh, I wish I had done that. You don't want that at the end. You want that in the process of the project work, so that in that way, that's when you see that collaboration. And you want to convince your students that that collaboration means better work. Better work later. But there is also another important point here about collaboration. Okay? And I will mention it in a minute. And because as I assess, I look, how did they work with others? Okay? Did they ask for help? Did they help others who might have needed help? And did they do their best? And I usually put those questions on the board. Sometimes in classes where the collaboration is weak, I will put this up on the board and I want them to rate each other 1 to 5 on this. And I will want, if they're working in a group, I want them to rate the other people in the group 1 to 5. Now, the final answer is not important. What I want is, in doing that bit of activity on rating each other and reflection, I am turning collaboration important. And what I tell my students here at this point is, collaboration is not only doing your best at this point and achieving your best at this point, I also tell them that for the future, when they have problems, when they have difficulties, if they are used to collaborating, they will have a way to overcome those difficulties because they are open to other suggestions. So later in their academic life, in other classes, at university, and then in work, when they come up to an obstacle that could be really difficult, if their skill in collaborating is well developed, they will have ways, they will be open to other people helping them overcome that obstacle. Okay? Now, let me see here. Another question. Let me see. Do you get them to reflect their process and the result? That's a very good question. As I mentioned here, I usually get my students to reflect both on communication and on collaboration. I just give them, if you notice the slides here that say assessing for learning, I give them those questions. I try to come up with 5 questions if I ask them to reflect. And in those 5 questions, I usually ask them to rate themselves, and in groups to rate each other on 1 to 5. I'm not looking for a right answer or a wrong answer. I'm not looking for everybody to get 5s or worried that everybody will get 1s. I am looking for them to see what they would give each other, to raise some curiosity on why they would give each other that, and for that activity to be one that raises some discussion, okay, amongst themselves and makes collaboration and communication important. So I do that for communication, I do that for collaboration, and I will do that for the project in general. Okay. Okay, let's see, I'm looking here. Okay. Now, the next one I'd like to talk about here is critical thinking. Critical thinking skills probably are better known within the 21st century skills. I have heard about them in the EFL classroom probably longer than I have the others. When we're talking about critical thinking here, I want them to be personally involved in the project. I also want them, because we're talking about teenagers, I want to developing their language noticing skills. We are in a language class. I want them to be critical of the language they are using, of the language they need in order to get that message across for their project. And I want them to be able to reflect on their learning, and as I just mentioned, on the process of the project itself. So in this case, in their personal involvement, I want their project to be personal. Okay, I don't want to get from them the same thing. And again, if we are talking here about the town, I don't want to get the same thing from them that I could get from the local tourist office. Okay, I want a unique, a personal point of view on the project. Now, those projects could be about their life. Those projects could be about a hobby, a pastime, an opinion. But whatever the project is, I want them to think, is it personal? Is it their own view? I want them to consider, is it interesting? Okay? I don't want them to do it just for me. I don't want them to do it because it meets what the teacher wants out of the class. Okay? And I want them to make it unique. Now, this is difficult for my students, but I make a point of making it an objective for them, of them trying to do something that maybe the others won't. It's a challenge, but in critically thinking about the language, the process, and all of their projects, I do want them to strive to develop a certain uniqueness there, because everyone has something unique to offer, so a point of view on their neighborhood, an opinion about something we're discussing in class. So I do look for that when I'm thinking about personal involvement. Okay, I'm also looking on noticing the language. We are talking about teenagers. If this were for primary, even if we're talking about higher primary, you as a teacher need to see if how much they can notice the language or not. Primary students, younger learners, usually learn a lot by imitation. But as we get to 12, 13, 14 years old, we begin to become more critical. Our brain begins to have a critical capacity to it. And I want to develop that. So I want them to notice the language. And do they use the language they know within their project? Or can I encourage them to use more language than they thought of? Okay? And that is within the language they know. And then, do they use the language they have just learned? My projects are usually the result of a unit or a module in the classroom. Okay, so we have done a lot of language, and it is natural for them not to use that language yet. It takes a while between them learning the language because I have asked them to, and them accepting that language as their own. So first, I look and I point them out. Can you use more language? Sometimes I directly tell them, go to your course book. Well, what kind of language was there in that unit? Is there anything, and there will be in the course book, labeled vocabulary, labeled grammar. And I will point them to those areas and say, have you used those? Could you use those? How could you use those? So that they are noticing that language in their project. Then I want them to reflect on that learning, on that process. Do they see the activity as a learning opportunity? Do they see it as, technology? My students sometimes get lost in the PowerPoint and in all the special effects, that takes more time than the language learning itself. Well, I want them to notice that that is a learning opportunity for language, for different skills, and I want them to notice and take advantage of that. Okay? Do they look at their work critically? Could it be better? Do they do it the night before or the week before? Have they taken advantage of me as their teacher to help with their language? Have they taken advantage of the talents that exist in the classroom? Okay? And then based on that, do they adapt? Do they change? So I want a first draft, a second draft, maybe a third draft. At some point, I need to stop the drafts, but do they adapt? Do they change? Do they notice how other students are working, and then in that way, okay, adapt and change their own projects? And in this way, they're critically thinking, they're personally involved, they're noticing the language, they're reflecting on what the language and what that project does as students, as learners, and then they adapt accordingly. Okay, so critical thinking for me is that ability to become actively involved, okay, but it's actively involved in their learning in different aspects. Not only actively involved from a personal point of view and doing a lot, not only actively involved for the language, but it's the personal, it's the language, and it's the learning opportunity and the reflection. Okay, all of that means a more personal involvement in the project itself. And I, again, look at my students and ask, again, as someone had mentioned before, do I ask them to reflect? Again, 4 questions that I ask my students. Did they use the language for real communication? Are they communicating? How much language did they use? Could they have used more? Did they correct mistakes, or did they just give up and say, I don't want to do any more? And in the end, that question that I like the most, I turn to a student and say, is this your best work? And if it is their best work, that's great. And we're going to do another project later on and really improve in that sense. Okay, I have here a question. Which exercises are the most effective for developing critical thinking? Which exercises? Now that's a very good question. I don't look, it depends on the student. In the 3 aspects that I have here in the webinar, I look, let me go back to, and then those 3 aspects, if a student is not paying attention to the language, they're great communicators, etc., but they can use the language more, I point them to language exercises. If a student is doing everything very well and the language is great, but they're not communicating, I will point to exercises, or I will give them exercises to get that message across. So again, this is a question that is a very good question. Whatever you ask your students to pay attention to out of these 3, for me, being important, then you are asking them to be more actively involved, you are asking them to be more personally involved, and by default, you are asking them to develop their critical thinking skills. Here, I think it's very important that what I tell my students is, they learn, I teach. So it's a 50-50 relationship. So so that critical thinking is them taking responsibility for their learning. What exercises do I give them for that? the exercises that each one might need. And it's a question of differentiated learning here. Okay, so look at your student and see which ones would help them the most. Okay, I'm looking to see if there are any more questions here. Can you post a link to the website? Interactive board, good. I see Lambda. Okay, okay, great. Okay, now as I come to the end, I mentioned that I would not be talking about creativity and ICT too much, and there's a reason for that. For me, creativity is a unique contribution. As I mentioned already, that I ask my students, is it unique? So creativity depends on each student. If you look at 3 of the examples of projects that I have in this webinar, so making a poster about my life, or my school, or my area, or it might be an opinion, or it might be a blog, I'm looking for what, I usually ask my students, surprise me. And these students may surprise me in their skills of technology, in the format that they use. I don't know. But what I ask for creativity is think outside the box. Surprise me. I have learned that some of my students were preparing for the Olympics at 14 years old. I had a student who was an award-winning ballroom dancer. When I asked them to be unique, when I asked them to say, what about you? What makes you different? Then I am encouraging their creativity. I am encouraging them to step outside the box. Okay? And that's usually what I mean about creativity. In relation to ICT, or Information Communication Technology, okay, now here I'm using technology used as a tool to enhance learning. And the key word for me there is enhance. Okay? I want that whatever they use for technology, I want them to justify that it's better than another format. I don't want them to make a PowerPoint because they like making PowerPoint, but nobody actually wants to watch it. I don't want them to make a blog post, to write a post that is so long that actually their friends do not want to read it all. So whatever they use, I want that to be the best way to get the message across. So now, I have here, in sharing that information in their use of ICT, I would like to say that in my mentioning of ICT here, I don't want to say that I don't want to limit ICT only to sharing the information. You can use technology in the process of doing the project work itself. Because of time and to focus, I've mentioned this in relation to sharing the information. And here I have just 4, there are many, there are 4 possibilities that students may make that traditional poster, but they can also put a poster online and use Glockster to make their poster. Students can use Animoto to make their film clip, or they can do a spoken presentation with visual. They can do a notice board in which a lot of them can go onto, by using Wallwisher, can add to that notice board until we have a complete class project. The important thing here is, whichever of these or others that they use, 2 things. 1, I am not a technology teacher, so I need for them to have this skill, or to be able to have someone who will help with these. Okay, that's important because otherwise my focus may go away from my own aims and objectives for the project. So they need to be comfortable with the ICT and bring it into the English classroom. And also I look, is this a way to do it that's better than another way? Why use Voki? Why use Glockster? What makes Glockster better than a traditional poster? And can I just say, most of my students will be motivated just because it's technology. And for me, that's enough. If using Glockster motivates them, That's enough for me. So, but I do ask them to look at that, because I remember someone mentioned here that their students like using PowerPoints a lot. My students like doing PowerPoints a lot, but I have found that too many times, especially my older students, focus so much on the PowerPoint and the effects of the PowerPoint that when I ask them, is this the best way to get the message across? It probably wasn't. Probably a film clip with them talking and showing would have been better. So again, that technology that they use, that we don't use technology just for its own sake. Okay? And as I finish here, so I look as, was the technology appropriate? Did it enhance the project? Did it make the project better? Okay? And was the student able to use it well? So when a student is deciding that they're going to use this or that technology, they are also accepting the responsibility that they have that. Something that comes up in my classes a lot was the idea that younger students, lower teenagers, 13, 14, 15-year-olds would count on using their father's computer or maybe a printer or something they would have at their father's work, and then at the last minute they weren't able to do it, or the printer ran out of ink, or something happened and they didn't have access to the technology. Again, that's their responsibility. They need to be able to have that access as they take on the responsibility for using that technology. Okay? And again, I'm noticing the time, and as I come to the end of this presentation, the 21st century skills, the 5 skills that I mentioned here, the skills that I focus on the most. You notice I focus very much on the first 3 as my role as a teacher to develop them. I hope to encourage and allow an environment for creativity, and I want my students' abilities in ICT, I want if they have access to the computer teacher or other friends who know about ICT, about a certain blog, about a certain website, whatever it is that they want to use, that they bring in, and I want to focus these in the project work. Okay? So I hope that we have defined 21st century skills, that you consider the role of the teacher and the student and that sense of responsibility, that you include the 21st century skills in project work, that it takes a greater focus in what you have already done in your project work experience, and that you include the development of those 21st century skills in your assessment so that students also take it very seriously. Okay? I'm looking at the chat box. I will look, let me see. Which exercise are the most effective? Popular topics for projects. Wow, that's a difficult one. My most popular topic that I've ever had was when I base it on students' opinions. And I should say that my most popular project has been when I was working with Should, and I asked my students in groups that they create a project on what is or what should a good student do. But not only that, what should a good student do? What should a good teacher do? What should a good friend do? What should a good son or daughter do? And what should a good parent do? And why all of those? So that each group is working on a different topic, so that when we have the projects, just by the nature of the topic and the subject they chose, the question they chose, everyone is interested in agreeing or disagreeing. So probably my most popular projects have been those based on opinions, because it made it easier for my students to take them personally. Okay, but any project, any topic that your students can take on personally, I think is very good. One of the projects that I had was a 2-day visit by someone else to their area. How would they spend those 2 days from the point of view of a teenager? And most of them did not say the traditional tourist sites that you would have expected. Okay. Let me look to see if there are any other questions. Just to say, I will be here after I turn the video and the audio back to Sean. If anybody has any questions, I will pay attention to the chat box and I will answer them. So looking at time, I want to thank everyone very much for being here for me this afternoon. For Svetlana, if I remember the name correctly, at the early hours in the morning, all the way from Argentina to Vladivostok. Thank you everyone for being here. Everyone, no matter what time it is in your area, have a very good weekend and enjoy doing projects with your students. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
and bye-bye.
Everybody's
Son,
saying
back to you.
nice things about the webinar. In there, as Very said, he's still there for a while. If you want to, if you missed a question, you've still got an opportunity to get him on the chat board. Remember that I'm going to stop the recording now.